There's lots of laughter and positivity in the room, and I take that means that everyone's had their afternoon coffee now, feeling really enriched with all the learning we've experienced today, and looking forward to our last session. This will be our final panel. It will be followed by drinks and canapes afterwards. Really interested in listening to this next session. I find the next topic quite challenging personally, and I'm really interested in learning more. So the topic is engaging men and boys in primary prevention. It'll be facilitated by Lizette Twisleton, who is the head of sector development at No to Violence. She has worked in the human and community services sector for 30 years for NGOs and in local government. Lizette has experience in domestic and family violence, having worked with victim survivors and men who use family violence. She has a background in nursing, youth work, health promotion and community development. She has specialised in men's behaviour change work over the past 18 years, 12 years as a men's behaviour change program facilitator, 3 years delivering partner contact and 5 years leading sector development projects and strategies nationally at No to Violence. Lizette has also provided training and supervision focusing on men's behaviour change work. Lizette is passionate about working collectively and collaboratively to create lasting safety for families, and she'll introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I am working. Okay. Thanks. It's great to be here and great to see so many familiar faces. Before I start today, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all meeting on the traditional lands of the Eora Nation, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and to all Aboriginal people who are here in the room today, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, and always will be First Nations lands. We have a really interesting panel here today. We are actually missing one of our panellists, and I think we're all feeling really sad about that. So James Moore was going to join us. James is from Bourke, and he's doing some really incredible work there. He's part of the tribal group that operate the Maranuka project out there, the Justice Reinvest. He works for Catholic Care. And coordinates the men's hub, and he does a lot of work in his community, working especially with young men and boys and young men, and his work's very much about coming back to culture. And we had a conversation the other day for a sort of good hour or so, and we're really looking forward to James being part of this conversation and all of the incredible work that he's doing, but also what he brings to this space in regards to connecting young people back to culture. So sorry that James is missing today, but we do have some really wonderful panellists here, and what I'm going to do is ask them to just introduce themselves and tell us briefly what's led them to sort of move into this area of work of primary prevention, working with boys and men, and then we will talk a little bit more in more depth about the work that they're doing.
Thank you. My name is Deanne Carson. My pronouns are she, her. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and thank the Aboriginal women who have spoken today in your truth-telling. I appreciate how much labour you've put into educating all of us who are not First Nations people. I head up an organisation called Body Safety Australia. I founded it in 2015. We do primary prevention work and only primary prevention work. We work in early childhood, in primary schools, in secondary schools, and it's whole community work. So we never work with the children without meeting with their parents and caregivers first. And we also do professional development with teachers and any other professionals working with children. What brought me to this work is that I was working in sex ed and I loved it. Lots of puberty education, lots of condoms on bananas, lots of going into spaces where they were cocky, and that's not a pun, teenage boys slapping a dildo down on the table and, showing them how to use a condom. had so much fun in that space, but there was a serious side to the work, and that was that I was hearing disclosures of sexual abuse from children as young as 5, 6, 7, 14, 15 years old, sometimes 5, 6, 7 disclosures a term. And the sex ed curriculum did not address childhood sexual abuse or peer sexual assault directly, and I felt that that had to shift. I am from Melbourne. I was fortunate enough that at the time that I was wanting to make that shift, we had the Betrayal of Trust inquiry in Victoria that led to some changes in how we address primary prevention and childhood sexual abuse, and that coincided with the start of our organisation.
Hi there everyone, my name's Michael Hale, pronouns he, him, and also want to pay respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. You'll guess from my accent that I'm not from these lands, so when I pay acknowledgement to country I do it with sincerity, and I'm really humble and honoured to be here today. Taking a deep breath, because looking at lots of people's faces, and I'm sure you're all expecting me to come out with nuggets of wisdom in the next 55 minutes. I just want to really be honest with you, just to introduce myself. I am a son, I'm a brother, I'm a member of many communities, and I'm really passionate about this work. I'm a youth worker by trade. I studied community education in Scotland. I was working in the East End of Glasgow. For people who know of that community, has a bit of a reputation around violence and harm, and certainly a lot of the work that I was involved with was engaging men and boys around that. I'm just really nosy. I just wanted to know a little bit more about it. I can't say when I was 10 and 11 years old I imagined that I would be working in this space, as many of you I'm sure are the same, but I really just found my calling to asking a lot of questions, wonderings. What's brought me to this space on these lands? Essentially, I was getting to the age where I was fortunate enough to be able to travel. I don't usually wear the clothes that I'm wearing just now. Usually it is tracksuit pants and hoodies. And I wanted to make the full use of the privilege that I have as a white, cisgender, heterosexual male, and travel. Experience different cultures, learn, listen, and then the lockdowns happened and I've stayed. So hopefully there isn't anyone from the Department of Immigration here today, because we can have some conversations afterwards, but that's certainly what's brought me here today.
Hey everyone, my name is Kristoff, Adelbert. My pronouns are he, him. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge also that this is Aboriginal land. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I live on Gayamagal land, or Gurungai land, sort of up on Sydney's North Shore. And I just want to acknowledge the significance of the work that we do with sister girls and brother boys, and trans and gender diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who lead, particularly me in the work that I do, and others and other colleagues lead us in understanding the true meaning of gender equity and this really, really important work. So I work at ACON, just down the road, in fact. ACON is one of the state's leading or largest LGBTQ community-controlled organisations. I'm a cisgender gay man, and I'm also a victim or a survivor of childhood abuse and violence. So I come to this space with a history of experience, but I also come to this space because I am tired of the way that marginalized communities are treated by people with privilege and power. I'm a certified trauma professional, so I've worked in sort of the client-facing space in South Africa. So I'm originally from South Africa, and I worked with the South African Police Service as a volunteer trauma counsellor. So I would respond with police to crime scenes to provide counselling to victims of crime, particularly of sexual assault. But I've come into the primary prevention space because, as has been mentioned on many occasions today, like the Band-Aid thing, it's really important, but I feel like it's not necessarily dealing with the cause. And so I'd like to have a go at dealing with the cause. So that's what has brought me to this space. I actually specialize in strategic communication, so communicational campaigns that promote social change or create social change. And so I'm the campaign lead at ACON for primary prevention, a national primary prevention campaign. So I've, along with a few others, have designed a series of campaigns that firstly drive visibility of healthy relationships, but also challenge those really harmful drivers of violence that are somewhat unique to LGBTQ communities, such as cisgenderism and heteronormativity, biphobia, transphobia, and homophobia. Yep. That's it.
Thanks, everybody. When we were having our initial conversation last week, this came actually out of a conversation that we were listening to James for a while, and we were thinking what would we call this session, and so what we came up with was healing before harm, working towards a world free of violence. And in our area, it's about working with people who use family violence or who use violence. So we often refer, and we're talking about men and boys, but clearly we're talking about anyone who is using violence, family violence against their loved ones. And just, I suppose, in those conversations, we started, for me, having worked in a response space and in the early intervention space, how important it is that we have primary prevention, that we stop this before it starts, that we actually work towards creating generations where we're not going to be doing the kind of really sad and long-term work with families to do the healing work that we heard our previous panel talking about. So we know this is a long journey, and it's really important that we have the courage and the bravery to work with boys and men particularly, and people who are using, who are working towards developing the kind of mindsets, the attitudes and the behaviours that they may take into early relationships. And how do we work with men so that they understand if and can notice if their friends or colleagues or in their workplace what is happening. So there's a really massive piece of work for us all to do as a whole society in actually sort of creating the primary prevention and shifting this culture. So there's primary prevention programs, which is really fantastic, and that's what we're going to hear about today. And the people sitting here are going to talk a bit more in depth about what they actually do and who they do that work with. But this is definitely a whole of society response that we all need to be thinking about primary prevention. And even those of us who are working at sort of the other end of the scale and seeing that the really strong connection. We talked a lot about that spectrum of having safety over here and deep trauma over here, and how do we actually shift across that spectrum so that we make sure that we're actually reaching everybody, and that those people who are not using harmful behaviours are able to understand what it looks like, able to respond in their own ways within their own communities and support the change that needs to happen. So I'm going to now pass back to my fellow panel members, and they're going to each talk in a little bit more depth about what they do, who they work with, and give us some examples of what that actually looks like, because we're kind of guessing that that's what you really want to know about.
How long do you have? So we run a variety of programs. In early childhood, we have a program called Superstars, which looks at the prevention of childhood sexual abuse. So it's a program that we run with 3 and 4-year-old children, and we have a workshop with their parents and caregivers that we run prior to the program. That's not just informative, It's in helping them understand what grooming looks like, and not just what grooming looks like, but how to be courageous enough to intercept grooming. Yeah, because that's obviously where we can do the work before harm begins. We also have a program in early childhood that's only for the early childhood educators and teachers, which looks at gender equity in early childhood, and it doesn't just look at gender equity as far as are we treating boys and girls equitably, but are we also making space for gender non-conforming and transgender children as well. So that's the work that we do in early childhood. Awesome, fantastic. Children cannot protect themselves. 3 and 4-year-olds cannot protect themselves. It is essential that we have adults in those spaces. None of you would be surprised to know that the adults that come to those spaces are mums. Sometimes we've had to bribe the dads to come, but we generally have a split. I'm going to say no more than 15% dads on average that come to those conversations. There's only been one school since 2015 where we've had more dads than mums there. Yeah. We work in primary schools, so we do a lot of work being from Victoria and being fortunate to be from Victoria when the Respect for Relationships curriculum was rolled out. We worked with a lot of the lead schools in supporting the teachers in delivering that work. That looked like delivering, for those of you who are familiar with Respect for Relationships, Units 7 and 8, which looks at gender, delivering those units for the teachers, delivering parent workshops, delivering professional development for the teachers, capacity building, and we've now, over a period of 3 to 5 years, with a lot of those lead schools, left them on their own. We go in and work with the parents, but actually the schools now have the capacity to do that work on their own. Secondary schools, lots and lots of consent and respectful relationships work. Lots of consent work. Some of you might remember me from that crazy pink-haired dyke who told parents that they had to ask consent to change babies' nappies. Remember that? Yeah, that me. Still getting death threats, by the way, when we're talking about engaging boys and men. That was in 2017. Still getting death threats from all over the world. When it first happened, I was contacted by police to say that a lot of the people who were driving those threats were known perpetrators of sexual violence. They had reason to want to shut me down. So lots of consent work, and obviously in that space, the engaging boys space. In upper primary and in secondary, so pubescent and adolescent boys, is super, super essential, and love that part of our work. And I'm really happy to talk more about that in a minute.
So I should probably introduce the organisation I'm representing. Spent more time talking about myself. I am the manager of primary prevention at the Men's Project, which is part of Jesuit Social Services. 2016, Jesuit Social Services, who do a lot of stuff at the point of crisis, those who are exiting prison, those who are looking for extra support around accessing homes, really started to identify that the vast majority of their client base were male. That kind of falls in line with what we know in our space around the vast majority of perpetrators being male. We also know within an education setting the vast majority of exclusions are male. Noticing a common theme here, and that's what Jesuit Social Services done in 2016, set up the Men's Project to understand a little bit more about what's going on here. What's going on around masculinity, what men and boys and those who identify as men and boys believe a real man and boy should behave and act like. And in 2018, they published the research, The Man Box, which I'm sure some of you will have read. But essentially, The Man Box is a piece of research where we asked 1,000 young men and boys across Australia, what do you think are the attitudes and behaviours that a real man and boy should have. But we didn't just ask that, we also asked them, what do you think society believes that a real man and boy should have? And it was quite interesting to look at the difference there. And I want to start with a positive. I'm not leaving that till the end. I want to actually share that the vast majority of men and boys that were surveyed had positive and healthy attitudes. Quite a lot of them did not think that you had to act tough, to be hypersexual, to be looking a particular way. But certainly the evidence did suggest that there was a proportion of people who did personally endorse those views and do believe that they had to act a certain way. I think the more stark thing for us in our work was to really unpick what young men and boys thought society expected of them. 69% of the people that we asked felt that they had to act tough, even when they didn't know what to do. The fact that over 50% of the people that we asked felt that pressure to be the breadwinner. And I think that sits alongside what we've heard today around the research. And that's not to say that these people are not being harmful within their relationships, but these were often young men. We surveyed 18 to 30-year-olds. So what we're doing with that, and we do three parts of work, three elements of our work at the Men's Project. First of all, it is research. It's robust research into what do men and boys and those who identify as male actually think about this issue. We are looking to update the Man Box research because that was a number of years ago, so we are looking to do that again. But we're also looking at that intersection around adolescence. What do young men, in particular those aged 12 to 18, think it means to be a boy? That then informs our effective attitudinal change, because we know that there are attitudes that drive this, and certainly working in close quarters with colleagues who, like Our Watch, No to Violence, and those in the domestic and family violence sector, to understand more about that. But what is it? What are these attitudes? What do people actually hold on to with the age group that Deanne's already spoken about? And we also want to look at effective interventions and early interventions. And early intervention doesn't need to be with a 3-year-old. Early intervention can be with someone who is an adult as well. So we're really interested in actually going into spaces where men, boys, those who identify as male are, spend time, and actually ask the question, what does this mean to you? For us to then start to challenge some of these unhealthy things that we know go behind some of these behaviours that I know that you're on the front line facing. It's interesting work, but it's one that is not in isolation, and I think I just want to make this point before sharing it. I spend a lot of time in the role that I have actually listening and really taking on board what was shared in that conversation around intersectionality. We at the Men's Project really see this as informing the work that you're doing, and hopefully us being informed with what you're doing as well. So just wanted to kind of set that up, that it's not us away in another space, it's really connecting with what you're already doing.
So like I mentioned earlier on, I've led the design and delivery of a campaign, and something that was mentioned earlier on around the effectiveness of multimedia campaigns has really stuck with me. For LGBTQ people, visibility is tough to come by. And one of the reasons why we felt that it was important for us to push forward or at least request funding or apply for funding for a campaign is because mainstream visibility of a diversity of relationships is really important for LGBTQ people. It's also really important for cisgender heterosexual people because it starts to break down some of the stigma, some of the discrimination and prejudice that cisgender heterosexual people have of LGBTQ people, and also starts to sort of unpack some of the internalized shame and stigma that LGBTQ people have about themselves and their relationships. So this project, I came on board 18 months ago, and of course, I work with people of all genders and all sexuality. So it says engaging men and boys. Our project engages everyone. The project's not funded for research, but what has been mentioned previously is that there really is no evidence in terms of LGBTQ communities. Understanding the drivers of violence in LGBTQ communities, there is an absence of evidence. We have to make a lot of assumptions. So our project logic for our project makes assumptions around the drivers of violence. And those were the points of departure from which we conducted our own research. So we weren't even funded to do research, but we did it anyway. And when I say we, it was like me. And so we put out a national survey, and we got a sample of about 480 people nationally. It's not a representative sample, it's not generalizable data. But we asked questions about feelings of lack of worth. Have you ever felt or been told that you're unworthy of being someone's sexual or romantic partner as a result of? And then after the of, we put sexuality, gender, disability. And what we started to see in the data is the correlation between the prevalence of violence that certain LGBTQ communities experience and their feelings of lack of worth. So when it comes to gender, trans women, and we know trans women experience levels of violence that are incredibly alarming. Trans women experience those attitudes, those feelings of lack of worth, or have been told that they are unworthy of love as a result of their gender. We started to see linkages between the prevalence rates of violence against bisexual women and the attitudes that they experience. So our research indicated to us that indeed those drivers of violence that those attitudes do drive violence, and those prevalence numbers that we see link up to those attitudes. So we were able to identify evidence-based, identify how we would design the campaigns. The campaigns really were just about focusing on healthy relationships. We didn't want to solve. I knew from the outset that we're not going to solve all of the problems immediately, and I wanted to run out there, and I was like, right, we're gonna do everything. And we're going to try and speak to everyone. We're going to try and solve all of the problems. And I needed to come back down from that illusion. Like, the reality is that we needed to be really targeted. So we've focused very much on relationships that include bisexual women, for example, trans women in relationships with cisgender heterosexual men. All of those sort of scenarios or relationships that are seen as high risk, where violence seems to occur at much higher levels than elsewhere. And so it was a strengths-based approach. And we've rolled out a sequence or a series of multimedia campaigns across street posters, billboards, social media, 300 buses across the country, just driving visibility of these relationships, but including copy that really challenged those drivers of violence. So, for example, one of the messages is, being in a straight passing relationship doesn't invalidate someone having a queer or a bi experience. And just in that one quote, which came from the film that we shot on one relationship, we challenge a number of those really harmful drivers of violence, like biphobia, transphobia, cisgenderism, and then also positions that relationship as one that is really healthy and for the reasons that they outline in the film. And the evaluation, so that there's the campaign, the research in the beginning, and then the evaluation at the end, all of which we're doing in-house with a little bit of help here and there. But the evaluation is suggesting that for the first time, people who are in relationships that may not necessarily be visible, for example, we feature in a relationship, there's a culturally and linguistically diverse trans femme non-binary person living with disability in a relationship with a cisgender heterosexual man. And there are a number of people that have approached us after seeing their film and said, wow, for the first time I feel seen, for the first time I feel like I want to stand up and talk about my relationship. So there's that aspect of the campaigns. The other aspect is that our call to action is to drive people to the Say It Out Loud website. I also lead the management of that website, so I've become like a web technician as well, which I'm really not, but I've become that because it's an integral part of the project. So the campaign drives people to the website, and the website it's the first online resource for LGBT. Am I talking a lot? Is that okay? It's the first online resource for LGBTQ people that provides support for people using abuse or experiencing abuse, for friends, family, bystanders, and professionals. I would love if you all just checked it out as well. That'd be great. It's a really beautiful resource. And in that space, it's a safe space for LGBTQ people who can find the information that they might need, having seen the campaign. If they look at the relationship that they see in the campaign, they go, my relationship doesn't look like that. They go to the website, they find all the support that they need. If they're looking for a service that is affirming and inclusive, which is not a given for LGBTQ people, all of our services that are listed in our service finder are inclusive and affirming. And so we close that loop. Which is really important. We've seen activity on the website. It's the busiest it's ever been since its launch in 2020. And we're starting to see people use the Healthy Relationships quiz sort of 400% more than previously. So there are a number of kind of tools on the website that are really useful. So there are a number of specific evaluation outputs and outcomes that are showing that this campaign is not only kind of empowering LGBTQ people, providing them with the space and the knowledge to be able to seek support when or if they may need it.
And I think you've all kind of answered this a little bit in your speeches so far, but just reflecting on the previous panel, which was absolutely fantastic, and thanks so much for that. What are some of I'd like you to discuss some of your experiences in designing programs and then delivering them, and some of the ethics that kind of sit behind that, given that we know that we're working actually in that really tricky space of often working with within the cohorts and people who we know may very well go on to use violence in their lives.
That's a really big question.
Late spring on the
No. There are so many different ways that I could answer that. That's all. In the design of the programs, obviously they're evidence based. So we use evidence from around the world to inform the programs. We work with academics. We work with teachers to make sure that they're pedagogically sound. We work with child and adolescent psychologists to make sure that they're psychologically safe. But because we do whole of community work, so we're not working, like in just an LGBTIQA plus space, or just a First Nation space, or just a culturally diverse space. We're working in schools that encompass all of the people in our community. It's been really important for us to embed that in everything that we do. I have now a team of 16 educators, and give me a clap for that because it was 8. Because we just onboarded 8 new educators in this month and I'm tired. But the head of our education team is an Aboriginal woman. Our team is 70% queer, with that being like 40% trans non-binary. Our team is made up of people who have physical and visible and invisible disabilities, people who are neurodivergent, people who are migrants, people who come from a variety of faith-based backgrounds. The children that we work with must see themselves represented. That is not negotiable in our organisation. We get requests from Koori kindergartens. We will only ever send the amazing Lauren French. Look her up. She's got a podcast. She's extraordinary, our head of education. We will only ever send Lauren there. She's busy building her First Nations team at the moment. So for us, ethics look like that. But ethics also look like, so often we get asked by schools, can you come and do a consent workshop because our boys have been very, very naughty boys and they've been upskirting the girls and they've been posting that on TikTok and they think it's hilarious, and just can you come and do an assembly? And for us, the ethical answer to that is no. No, we will not. Absolutely, we will not. That is not safe. Yeah? We know that there are victim survivors in that school cohort, not just the students, but the teachers as well. We know that there are perpetrators of violence in that school cohort, not just the students, but the teachers as well. We know that there may possibly be, and we come across this time and time again, teachers colluding with students who are using gendered violence or sexual violence at school. So to us, one of our ethical considerations is, and we are fee for service, we are totally unfunded, is how do we ensure that we do safe works in communities that cannot afford to pay us? And I haven't solved that yet. If anyone's got a pot of money, I know I'm speaking to the wrong audience. But these are the tensions that we work with in our organisations all of the time. No, I won't do an assembly. What we need is at least 4 hours stretched over a period of time, so 1 hour sessions over 4 weeks minimum, in their classroom groups of no more than 24 students. And in some schools, you know, we did that recently at one of the largest public boys' schools, actually just on Monday. It seems like, have I told you it's been a long month? We did that on Monday at one of the largest boys' schools in, public boys' schools in Melbourne. That's just kind of given it away, hasn't it? I said public, sorry about that. And there were 13 cohorts of Year 11 and 12 cohorts of Year 12s. That means I needed 13 educators on the ground. All of my educators are really highly qualified, you know, so I have to pay them, and the school had to find the funding to do that. That's tricky. That's a tricky space to do, but if you are going to work in primary prevention, you need to ensure that you are making ethical decisions about safety, even if there's tension about how you get that across the line. Did that answer the question at all? Oh, awesome, good.
Look, I think just to expand a little bit on what we do in primary prevention is really focusing in on who in the communities that we work with, and really emphasising with, are influencers. And that notion of who influences who, and how those relationships, which sometimes it's intergenerational, sometimes that's peer relationships, but essentially who are the influencers and how can we help you have these conversations? So in terms of our ethics, it's really about us not parachuting in. It's really not even about saying to places, actually it has to be an institution like a school where curriculum's stretched already. It's actually about saying, where are the spaces that young people are going? Where are spaces that men and boys are already going? And how can we upskill yourself as an influencer when it comes to that? And really meeting them where it's at. And I think that then goes into the ethics of the work. I'm not going to go down the list of people that we are engaging with and the relationships that we have, because I think that's been covered already, and we really do come to that space really humble and want to work with. But I think in terms of the ethics is that we're not taking a blame or shame approach to this work. We are hearing stories of young men who have attitudes which are grossly unhealthy when it comes to relationships, not just with others but with themselves. We've done a piece of research in 2020 called Unpacking the Man Box, where we try to understand what's the link between the pillars of masculinity and some of these behaviours that young men are doing inwards when it comes to their poor mental health outcomes, when it comes to risk-taking behaviour. And what we do in our work is we present those to the influencers and say, this is why we're doing this work. And we're being really clear about that as well. And I think that's something else that we want to do. We're not doing this work by stealth. We are unapologetic why we are engaging with men and boys in primary prevention. The stats show us, but also the fact that there is a real need for conversations, and young men in particular are wanting these types of conversations. The vast majority of them feel that sense of unease, but also feel that pressure to fit in, and are changing themselves and their attitudes to fit in. But what's underneath that is their values. And I suppose for a tangible takeaway in terms of ethics, but also in terms of what you could do in whatever work you're doing, focus on the values. What kind of young man do you want to be? What kind of relationships do you want to have? Opening up these types of conversations doesn't need a primary prevention funded programme to have. I offer this as reassurance coming from a place where we haven't had funding for over a decade. And that this will go up and down depending on what state, what government, whatever structures we're working within. But the little subtle conversations and relationships that we have with these people is what we find invaluable, and that's something that we never compromise on. So the same as yourself, it's not one-offs. I'm sorry, if you're looking to do this work, where does it fit in with your wider curriculum? Where does it fit in with your wider stuff? Where do your young people go after school? Because we're talking here about a place and community where some people do not engage in that space. So we want to ask people, whether it's parents, whether it's whatever role you have, where could these conversations be had?
On ethics, quite simply, so the funder for my project always calls me and says, Kristoff, is your project community-led? And I say, of course it is. It has to be. It absolutely has to be led by the people that it speaks to, the people that it involves, the people that it's directed at. And so if I design a campaign that includes, so I can, I have lived experience in a couple of areas, but I am not somebody living with disability. And so when I designed a portion of the campaign that included people living with disability or a person living with disability, I would include and speak to stakeholders who would lead the design of that campaign, that element of the campaign. I established a community advisory group that was made up of a beautiful diversity of people from across the country, and it was a large community advisory group so that I could set up focus groups from that group of people and really test some of the campaign collateral and the assets with those people, and they could provide feedback to me as people with lived experience on a specific matter or with relation to a specific identity. The survey, I'm really cautious about surveys or about research because I feel like communities are really over-surveyed, they're over-researched, and there's a whole lot of kind of micro-research happening that can seem really repetitive, where the data isn't necessarily provided back to the community as a way of informing them. And so there's caution. I tread lightly with research. In this instance, I feel like it's really important because the drivers of violence in queer communities is not fully understood yet. But the ethics there, like really rigorous ethics, and really honour the time and effort community have gone to complete the survey by providing back to them a report that outlines what the data said, and then delivering a program that speaks to that data, that meets the needs in one way or another. May not meet all the needs, but certainly goes a long way towards doing that. So yeah, absolutely intersectionality, including a whole bunch of people, diversity of people. There was something else I wanted to say. Early on I said that we make assumptions around the drivers of violence. I want to reiterate, and I need to make this point, and I do all the time, the drivers of violence impact everyone. There are drivers of violence that impact cisgender, heterosexual people and LGBTQ people. I'm cautious about that separation because while there are some unique drivers of violence, the work that all of us do collectively with different communities benefits all communities. So while I'm kind of mandated to work with LGBTQ people, I understand and I'm conscious of the fact that by doing this work, I also am breaking down those stigmas and those stereotypes and those gender roles that drive violence for cisgender heterosexual women. And I feel like I really need to be conscious of that, because I can slip into that kind of space where I'm like, oh, LGBTQ people, LGBTQ people, LGBT people, and it's like, oh, actually, there's like a bigger project at work. And when especially in a space like this, when everyone comes together from just like this incredible diversity of organizations, I'm like, oh, there's this collective wisdom and this passion beyond just like single identities, you know. And that's what intersectionality is, and I think it's really, really special. There are other things I had in mind about ethics, but I've forgotten, so we'll just have to, yeah.
That was actually a great segue from me, because one of the things I'm reflecting on after hearing you speaking is having sat in men's groups for 12 years and really worked with men through programs. And one of the things that we ask, and different programs do it at varying times of their program, but is really starting to look at what is a man. So what are your beliefs? What did you grow up with? So we would often do an exercise that would, what is a man? And men would say, a man's strong, a man's the breadwinner, a man can't show fear, a man must always stand up for himself, a man is tough, a man doesn't let go. And then we'd say, where did you learn that? What did you learn about that, being that kind of man? And they would talk then about what it was like to be that kind of man. Ostracised sometimes, afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to not have a job, to not be able to be the provider of my family. And then we'd ask them, what do you wish you'd learned? And really incredible questions. These are men who are already in the system. These are men who are already causing incredible harm in their families. And so really sobering conversations. And at the end of those sessions, just feeling the heaviness in the room and going around those men after they say, I wished I'd learnt that it was okay to cry. I wished I'd learnt it was okay to be vulnerable, to be weak, to not know, to not have to be the leader. And then checking in with that really heavy energy in the room around what is it like to sit with us now. And so I think this is where the intersection into the connection to primary prevention really is very, very strong. And I can just see you want to say something there.
I'm just waving. And I think what Lizette was sharing there is at that pointy end, and actually in primary prevention we do something very similar, and I wanted to just kind of raise the energy in here as well. I'm recognising that we've got about 13 minutes before we all get a free beverage, and that's probably why most people are still here. But also to give you a proper, a specific example of how we do the exact same in primary prevention. And some people are already doing it in this room, but I want everyone just to take a minute, if you feel comfortable in doing so, just to fold your arms. And just notice how you're folding your arms, which arm goes underneath the bicep, which one goes over your arm. And then if you can just unfold your arms. And then someone's already muttering down there, he's going to make me do it the other way. You've been here before. Can I get someone can I get everyone, sorry, just to fold their arms the other way? And you hear the muttering in the room, don't you? And you hear that energy. And I just wanted to give that as an example of the type of work that we're doing in primary prevention. Because we facilitate a conversation, and I would, if I had more time, honestly, I'd love to just go around with a roving mic and say, how awkward was that? When did you learn how to fold your arms? Who taught you how to fold your arms? With the point being that if I came back to the conference next year, would you be motivated to fold your arms the other way? Most of you would probably be like, I'm actually not that interested. I could then say to you, well, if I was to give you $50, would you be more motivated to do it? And some of you will be like, well, yeah, actually, I would be more motivated. And this is another thing, that there needs to be a motivation to change attitudes. Men need to be motivated to do this. They need to see why they should be involved in this. And it's not about us getting on our hands and knees, but we have to show why this is going to benefit them in their lives, especially coming from a position of patriarchy and power and all that sort of stuff. But then also how difficult it is to change these simple things. You have to tune into it. And Lizette, when I heard you say that the conversation does go really deep, primary prevention tries to lift that up and make it accessible as well. And I think that's something that's probably across all the work that we do.
Yeah, and I wanted to reflect on that as well, just quickly. Primary prevention can be so much fun, and it doesn't have to be the big things. We had a school come to us and say, you know, we've really noticed, primary school, we've really noticed that the boys dominate the oval, and some of our girls want to play footy and they can't because the boys, and we tried having a day that was just for girls, but the boys sat on the sideline and told them how to play footy, right? And so we're not talking about violence here. We're talking about learning how to give up some space, yeah? How to make some room. And we did co-design with the children on creating a new oval and a new space. And that involved working with what you call kindergarten here. Is that first year of school? Okay. Working with children from kindergarten to grade 6 on like mapping the places that they like to play, bringing in AFLW players to tell the boys like how awesome girls are at footy. You know, like it was light, it was fun, and guess what? There are girls on the oval now. This is what real early primary prevention looks like. Yeah, we can do the work in the spaces where we're seeing that there are some boys who are holding attitudes and behaviours that are harmful, and we do that work too in small groups. But actually what we're talking about is who's got the microphone, or, you know, like in the classroom, where is the differential teacher attention? I can tell you it's 60% on boys. It's redressing those small things. Yeah? Thank you.
Absolutely. And that's the work that we need to do to heal before harm happens. Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask a really deep question about patriarchy, but I think I'm going to leave that right now because I think we've talked about it as well. Given that we all are growing up and socialised and deeply embedded in patriarchy. What I'd like to know are some of the unintended consequences from some of the work that you're doing, and then this is for each of you also noticing the time. And what are 3 things that you'd like to see change?
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, even though the unintended consequences bit was my suggestion. Okay, so, I might just start with the 3 things that need to happen, and I'll start with this, and it's something that I'm really passionate about, and that makes me a mixture of angry and really sad, and that is that the organizations that fund these projects, the people that lead those organizations, I'm trying to be as vague as possible, need to stop reinforcing the drivers of violence that our programs are trying to solve. Particularly at the moment for trans women. You know, I've worked tirelessly to design campaigns that challenge transphobia, challenge cisgenderism, and yet in the public space and in the political discourse, the exact opposite is being said. And so there needs to be consistency. Politics needs to reinvent itself. I know it's a big ask. Maybe it's not even possible. But the disconnect between policy and politics, although they're supposedly intrinsically linked because politics informs policy, is so glaring, and it makes our work really, really tough. Police, and this is more practical, in South Africa I worked as a trauma counsellor with the police. We would respond with the police and provide counselling services to victims of crime. I would really like to see that happen here. So having a GLOW or having like a DV kind of police officer isn't the same as having a counsellor or somebody who's got trauma-informed practice or specialties or is a clinician to attend with police. There's a difference. And something really, really simple, but really, really important. Earlier on, there was a conversation about consent and about talking about relationships or consent in the context of relationships that are not only cisgender heterosexual. Relationships look like many different things. I remember I had sex ed and there was a little doll and then there was like a man and it had, like there was a penis and then there was, and like a girl and then and I was just like, that stuff didn't. I was like, what? And like the reality is that relationships come in many different forms, and if that education is not going to come from a safe space, from a safe person, it's going to be sought elsewhere. Pornography is one of the ways that it's sought out, or at least the internet for a start. So, like from the very get-go, create the space for LGBTQ people to recognize their feelings in the stuff that they're seeing. So the feelings of attraction, whatever that may be, consent, what does a relationship look like for a different person, for a different identity? That's really, really important. Unintended consequences?
We can drop that question because I'm looking at the time.
Oh, damn, sorry. I could just go on and on.
Just 3 was my response when I first heard this question. Okay, first one I would say is, let's not have the voices of, and I'm picking it because I'm a youth worker by trade, but let's not do things for young people. Let's get them involved in the design. Let's get the voices of them in rooms like this instead of providing services for. And primary prevention is a key part of that. We are not running primary prevention programs for young people. It needs to be run with young people. Second point I would say, and it kind of goes in contradiction of what I've just said, and I see a few people like, yeah. My second point is primary prevention does not finish at the age of 18. And I know that the work of Our Watch really highlights this. But let's not think around primary prevention with the rigidity that we have at the present moment. Let's not just think about it in workplaces. Let's not just think about it in schools and in institutions that we've been bagging all day, to be honest. Let's think about where we spend our time and think, how can I do primary prevention there? And that goes to my final point, is that we're all practitioners, we all have job titles, but we all have roles within community. What can we do and what we already do to do primary prevention? I'm sure some people today were feeling a bit of that frustration of, well, I'm at the response end and I'm going to hear a lot about primary prevention, and there's all that tension that goes on. And people are tired, people are really frustrated. I'm feeling that today. But actually we're people. And if we can come into that with the relationships and connections that we have with our family, with our neighbours, with our friends, with our peer networks, and start to have some of that conversation, start to have some of that fun that we've spoken about. Make this conversation fun and accessible and engaging and not just your responsibility is the thing that I really hope that we can all take from today. And I'm also going on that journey as well.
I maybe only have 2. My first one is, let's stop making assumptions. I hear so many assumptions about what young people do and don't know. They're bollocks. Young people tell me completely different things. They are much smarter. They are much more knowledgeable. They are much better activists. They are much better connected than I and my peers were when we were young. Let's not make assumptions about the starting blocks for them, because they have so much knowledge and they're connected. Other assumptions that I hear are, but you're not going to say the words penis and vagina and, butt sex. Because we do inclusive, programs. And so, well, what does that mean? Are you going to talk about butt sex? Right, so because the parents won't like that. Because the parents won't be okay with it. Because we have a culturally diverse community. And culturally, the parents won't be okay. Bollocks to that. The parents are behind it 100%, and they are just desperate. The majority of parents are just desperate for, how do I have these conversations? I want to have these conversations. Can you give me some starting tips to having these conversations? In fact, the only parents that we have that push back hard on the work that we do are people who perpetrate family violence.
Thank you, and thank you to these amazing panellists and the incredible work you're doing.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. It was really interesting. Really interesting listening to you all speak about your work and the ethics and the values with which you do that work. Thank you.